Someone on the internet says a judge mistreated an immigrant child in court, but when you actually read the court transcript and the written order, you see something very different. You see a judge doing exactly what the law requires. So today on the Sammy C Show, we're going to do something radical. We're going to read the record. Online agitator Jaime Abeytia recently posted a video claiming that Judge Marlene Gonzalez of the 388th District Court in El Paso has been treating children unfairly in immigration-related family cases. He even implied the Catholic Church had to step in. But the court record shows something very different. The organization involved is Estrella del Paso, formerly Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services. That is a non-profit legal aid organization providing immigration services. It is not the Catholic Church itself. And one of the cases being cited to attack the judge is, in the interest of DUFM, a child cause number 2025 DCM 3581. So let's look at what actually happened in that courtroom. According to the court transcript, the hearing took place on September 24, 2025. Attorney Jacob Wedemeyer, appearing for the petitioner, told the court the child was an unaccompanied migrant and they were seeking a dependency order. The first witness called was Brenda Ramon, an occupational specialist with Estrella del Paso. She testified she had met the child in June of 2025 after he arrived at a shelter. That's important. Because the judge immediately began asking questions, not to attack the child, but to clarify the legal elements required under federal immigration law and Texas family law. That's the judge's job. Next, the petitioner himself testified. According to the transcript, he stated, he was born in Guatemala. He experienced physical abuse from his father. He began working at a very young age to support his family. He later traveled to Mexico, where he worked several jobs. He also testified that he was kidnapped twice by criminals in Mexico. Those are disturbing facts. But here's where the judge's questioning becomes critical. The child testified he moved to Mexico around age 13 and worked there for several years. He also testified he traveled back and forth between Mexico and Guatemala. At one point, the judge asked, if you were able to move between Guatemala and Mexico, why didn't you remain in another part of Mexico? The judge was testing something very important, not cruelty, but legal eligibility. Now, here's a moment from the transcript that tells you exactly what the judge was doing in that courtroom. During the hearing, the petitioner testified that he experienced abuse from his father in Guatemala. But he also testified that he left Guatemala and moved to Mexico when he was about 13 years old, where he worked multiple jobs and lived independently for several years. So the judge began asking questions about the timeline, not to attack the child, but to determine whether the legal requirements for a dependency finding were actually met. At one point, the judge asked a critical question. If the abuse occurred years earlier in Guatemala, and the petitioner later lived and worked independently in Mexico, how does that establish a current dependency on this Texas court? That's an essential legal question in these cases, because under federal immigration law, a court must determine that reunification with a parent is not viable due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment, and that the child is dependent on the court for protection. When the timeline raises questions about those elements, a judge is required to examine it closely. That's not hostility, that's judicial analysis. And once the judge finished reviewing the testimony, the timeline, and the evidence submitted, the court reached its legal conclusion. This isn't speculation. This is the transcript from the courtroom. Every question the judge asked is recorded. Every answer is recorded. And once you read it, the internet version of this story starts to look very different. Under federal immigration law, special immigrant juvenile status, often called SIJS, requires very specific findings from a state court. The court must determine 1. The child is under 21 and unmarried. 2. Reunification with a parent is not viable due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment. 3. It is not in the child's best interest to return to their home country. 4. The child is dependent on a state court. These requirements come from 8 CFR, Section 204.11, and federal immigration law. A judge cannot simply accept a story. They must make specific factual findings supported by evidence. After reviewing the testimony and exhibits, the judge issued a written order. The court found several key problems. First, many of the abuse allegations involved events that allegedly occurred years earlier before the child moved to Mexico. Under Texas Family Code, paragraph 153004A, courts typically consider abuse evidence within a 2-year window when determining conservatorship issues. Second, the court found the testimony did not establish a current pattern of abuse or neglect attributable to the parents. Third, the court noted the petitioner himself testified that he chose to live in Mexico, where he worked and earned money as a street vendor. And finally, the judge noted that the petitioner admitted his primary reason for coming to the United States was to pursue education and a better life. Those may be understandable reasons, but they are not the legal standard required for SIJS relief. Based on the evidence presented, the court ruled that the petitioner had failed to establish required elements of proof. Specifically, the petitioner failed to prove that reunification with his parents was not viable due to abuse or neglect under Texas law. The court also questioned whether the petitioner was still dependent on the court, noting that he had become adultified and was nearing age 18. Because of those legal deficiencies, the court denied the motion, not out of cruelty, but because the legal requirements were not met. Narrative online: a judge mistreated a migrant child. Actual court record: the judge reviewed testimony, analyzed immigration law, applied Texas family law, and determined the legal elements were not satisfied. That's not misconduct. That's judicial responsibility. Now consider the political context. The judge being attacked online has over 20 years of immigration law experience. She is the only family court judge in El Paso with that background. And one of the loudest voices pushing these claims online is Jaime Abeytia, who, according to public reporting, is currently on DUI probation. So the public should ask a simple question: is this about protecting children, or is this about politics and the next judicial election?
Like, follow, and share. Because here on the Sammy C Show, we don't deal in rumors, we deal in court records.